The men at the general store watched her through the wavering heat of a late August afternoon. They saw a woman alone, her movements a kind of madness in the relentless sun. Agnes knelt, her back to them, laying strips of venison across a long wooden rack. Her golden retriever, Sol, lay in the sliver of shade cast by the cabin, his head on his paws, amber eyes tracking her every move. Each strip of meat, cut to a uniform thickness, was placed with a deliberate space around it, allowing the dry mountain air to do its work. Laughter drifted from the store's porch, a lazy, unthinking sound. One man nudged another. "She means to dry the whole mountain before the first frost," he said, loud enough to carry. Agnes did not turn. Her focus was on the task, on the slight curl of the meat's edge as the sun began its immediate work. She had 3 such racks, each 20 feet long, and they were already half full with the bounty of a successful hunt. Beside them, smaller racks held discs of summer squash and sliced beans, slowly shrinking into leathery permanence. To the men, it was a spectacle of excess, a widow's strange obsession. They saw a woman fighting a ghost, preparing for a winter that was always hard but never impossible. They saw wasted effort, a lonely woman making work to fill the silence. They did not see the meticulous ledger in her cabin, its pages filled with neat columns tracking yields, drying times, and the steady, dispassionate accounting of what it took to survive a winter that had already taken everything from her once. The scar on her right palm, a puckered white line, tightened as she pressed a final strip of meat into place. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked not at the men, but past them, up at the high peaks where the snow held even in the deepest summer. The mountain was telling a story, and she was the only one listening. The work was a litany of small, repeated motions. Before the sun was fully clear of the eastern ridges, Agnes was slicing. Venison and elk were cut with the grain into long, thin strips, then laid in a shallow wooden trough. She worked salt and dried herbs into the flesh, her fingers strong and sure, ensuring every surface was coated. This was the first cure, the drawing out of the water that held the threat of rot. The meat would sit for a day before being rinsed and carried to the racks. Vegetables were simpler but more voluminous. Bushels of beans were topped and tailed, then blanched in boiling water before being strung on long threads to hang from the porch eaves. Squash and pumpkins were peeled, seeded, and sliced into rounds no thicker than a coin, laid out on the mesh racks to turn from pale flesh to brittle, amber-colored chips. Berries were the most tedious, spread on wide, flat trays, picked over for any sign of mold, and turned daily until they resembled hard, dark beads. Her dog, Sol, would often nudge his head under her idle hand, a warm and living weight in a world she was methodically rendering dry and permanent. The Reverend Miller stopped by one Tuesday, his face a study in sincere, misplaced concern. "Agnes," he began, his voice soft, "the Lord provides. We must have faith. This looks like fear." He gestured to the rows of drying food, a landscape of careful provision. "It is work, Reverend," she said, not looking up from the corn kernel she was shelling. "And faith without works is dead." He paused, unable to argue with Scripture. "Of course. But the town worries. They see this and they think your grief has unsettled your mind." She finally looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. "My mind is settled on not starving." The exchange was over. He stayed a moment longer, then cleared his throat. "That lettuce in your garden looks fine." Agnes nodded toward the patch. "Take what you need." He left with a head of lettuce so crisp and sweet it was a shock to the palate, a taste of life in a yard dedicated to its preservation. From the edge of the woods, a small girl named Ruth watched him go, her gaze then settling back on Agnes, a silent, unblinking witness to the labor. A man named Mr. Harrison arrived in Covenant Peak on the late-season stagecoach, dressed in a city suit that seemed to repel the trail dust. He moved with an air of calculated warmth, shaking hands on the porch of the general store and speaking of a bright future. He represented a consortium, he said, investors who saw potential in the valley. He called a meeting in the small church hall, laying out maps on the pulpit. "A rail spur," he announced, his voice smooth and confident, "right through the lower valley. It will mean your goods get to market faster. It will mean supplies arrive reliably." All winter long the men in the room leaned forward, their faces alight with the promise of easier days. They asked about timelines, about costs. Mr. Harrison had answers for everything. "We break ground in the spring," he assured them. "This winter, we will be finalizing the surveys and securing the land rights. My company will even extend credit against the spring thaw for any families needing to see the winter through." It sounded like salvation. Dr. Finch sat near the back, his hand steepled under his chin. He did not watch Mr. Harrison. He watched the faces of the men, so the easy hope bloom. Later, the doctor was seen walking the base of the mountain, not looking at the ground for herbs, but up at the rock falls and the ancient, heavy-laden glacier. He carried his own notebook, making small, precise notations about the depth of the snowpack on the highest ledges, the color of the ice, the unusual quiet of the birds. Agnes did not attend the meeting. While the town dreamed of a future delivered by rail, she was on her knees in the root cellar, checking the seals on the ceramic crocks of salted pork, her scarred hand pressed against the cool, damp earth of the cellar wall, feeling the deep and steady chill of the coming season. The scar was a map of another time. When Agnes pressed her right palm flat against the rough-hewn timber of the new smokehouse, built of stone and solid mortar, not the flimsy wood of the old one, the memory returned. It was not a wash of grief but a series of cold, hard facts. A winter worse than any in living memory. A cabin miles deeper in the mountains, its roof sagging under an impossible weight of snow. The sound of her husband's coughing, a wet, ragged noise that grew weaker by the day. And then the silence. She had been alone with the boy. The memory sharpened to a single point in time, a small, feverish body wrapped in every blanket they owned, his breath a shallow rasp. "I'm cold, Mama," he'd whispered. His name was Samuel. He was 9 years old. The fire had died because the wood was gone and she was too weak from hunger to cut more. The last of the dried meat had been gone for a week. That was the central fact. Not the sorrow, but the tactical error. Not enough food. Not enough wood. Not a strong enough shelter. The scar was from a splintered log she had tried to break apart with her bare hands in a final, useless burst of desperation. She never made that mistake again. Her work now was not an act of mourning but a correction of that error, a permanent and unyielding rebuttal to that cold, silent cabin. A movement at the edge of her clearing broke the reverie. A boy, no more than 16, stumbled out of the trees. He was skeletal, his clothes in rags, his face hollowed out by starvation. He collapsed before he reached her porch. She and Sol went to him. The dog licked the boy's face, a low whine in his throat. Agnes knelt, felt the thready pulse at his neck. She and the dog helped him inside, his body a dead weight. She did not ask his name or where he came from. She put a pot of thin broth on the stove and, when it was warm, spooned it carefully into his mouth. His name was Thomas, she would learn later. For now, he was simply a problem to be solved, the first step of which was broth. The snow began in early October, a fine, dusting sugar that coated the pines and settled in the hollows. The townspeople of Covenant Peak welcomed it. It was pretty. It settled the dust. But it did not melt. A week later, another fall, thicker this time, and the air grew sharp with a cold that had no business arriving before November. The laughter on the general store's porch was quieter, replaced by low murmurs about the hunting season being cut short. Dr. Finch came to Agnes's cabin, his own ledger under his arm. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He opened his book on her kitchen table next to hers. "My records of the last 30 years show no measurable snowfall holding this long before the first week of November," he said, his finger tracing a line of spidery script. Agnes nodded, turning a page in her own book. "The Peakers didn't gather winter hay this year," she said. "They burrowed straight down. The elk came down from the high meadows a month early." The doctor looked at her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had arrived at the same conclusion by different paths. "The passes will close early," he stated. "They may already be closed," she replied. She poured him a cup of chicory coffee. He accepted it with a nod. In town, Mr. Harrison was a beacon of calm. "A little early winter, gentlemen, nothing more," he told the anxious store owner. "My supply wagons are hardy. They've dealt with worse." They'll be here before the month is out, loaded with flour, salt, and Christmas finery. The men in the saloon, warmed by whiskey, chose to believe him. They laughed about the first flurry, placing bets on when it would melt. At Agnes's cabin, Thomas, now with some meat back on his bones, said nothing. He simply picked up the spare axe and began splitting the massive rounds of pine she had felled in July, his movements becoming more efficient with each swing. He watched her, and he learned that the time for talk was long past. The world went white. It did not begin as a storm, but as a thickening of the air, a slow erasure of the horizon. Then the wind came, a low moan that grew into a physical force, driving a blinding sheet of snow sideways. For 3 days, it did not stop. When the wind finally dropped, Covenant Peak was buried. The houses were white humps, the spaces between them filled with drifts that rose to the eaves. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket pressing down on the entombed town. The initial mood was one of awe and inconvenience. People dug their way out, creating a network of narrow canyons through the snow. The general store became the center of life, its pot-bellied stove radiating a circle of warmth and nervous chatter. But the shelves began to empty with alarming speed. The promised supply wagons from Mr. Harrison were now an impossibility, a foolish dream from another lifetime. The women who gathered at the town well, now a deep pit carved out of the snow, no longer traded gossip. Their talk was sharp, fearful. "Merriweather is out of flour," one said. "The store's got no more salt pork," said another. Their casual cruelty from the summer was gone, replaced by a brittle anxiety. One morning, there was a quiet knock at Agnes's door. It was the child, Ruth. She was not there for food. In her hands, she held a small slate and a piece of charcoal. She looked at Agnes with solemn eyes. "May I come in?" Agnes stepped aside. The girl entered, unwrapped her scarf, and sat on a small stool in the corner by the hearth, away from the main working area of the kitchen. She did not speak again. She simply watched as Agnes moved from the pantry to the cellar, her dog a silent shadow at her heels. Agnes was conducting an inventory, cross-referencing the contents of her crocks and sacks with the entries in her ledger. Ruth watched her, and on her little slate, she began to write, copying the strange arithmetic of survival. The cascade began with the flour. The general store sold its last bag, and a quiet, desperate panic took hold. Then the doctor's laudanum ran low, meaning injuries and illnesses became far more serious. A week into the deep freeze, the roof of the livery stable collapsed under the weight of the snow, killing 2 horses that were vital for any future attempt to break through the passes. Each small disaster fed a larger despair. The town was an island in a sea of white, and its resources were bleeding away. Reverend Miller held a service every evening, his congregation huddled together for warmth in the unheated church. He prayed with fervor, his voice echoing in the frigid air, but his words about faith and divine providence began to feel hollow against the gnawing reality of hunger. Children were crying. The old were becoming weak. The truth about their predicament was revealed not in a public announcement, but in a quiet, overheard conversation. Dr. Finch, seeking a private word with the blacksmith about rationing coal, passed by Mr. Harrison's room at the boarding house. The door was ajar. Inside, Harrison was speaking to the one man who had arrived with him, his voice low and devoid of its public warmth. The geological survey was clear, Harrison said. A 100-year winter. The passes were certain to be blocked by mid-October. They'll be desperate enough to sign over their deeds for pennies by February, the associate murmured a question. The wagons. Harrison laughed, a dry, ugly sound. The wagons were never coming. Their debt is our asset. Dr. Finch stood frozen in the hallway, the cold in his bones suddenly having nothing to do with the temperature. He understood now that they were not just victims of a storm, they were the subjects of a deliberate and patient cruelty. He turned and walked away, the knowledge a toxic weight in his gut. The church was colder than ever for the meeting Dr. Finch called. It was not a prayer service. He stood at the pulpit, not as a preacher, but as a physician delivering a terminal diagnosis. He laid out the facts of their dwindling supplies, the number of sick, the brutal mathematics of how many days they had left. The room was silent, the faces pale in the lantern light. Then, he told them what he had overheard. He repeated Mr. Harrison's words plainly, without drama. The wagons were never coming. A collective intake of breath, a rustle of shock and anger, was the only response. Mr. Harrison himself was there, sitting in the front pew as if he were a concerned member of the community. He rose slowly to his feet when all eyes turned to him. He did not look flustered. He looked bored. "It is the nature of business," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "Assets and liabilities. Foresight is an asset. Your lack of it is a liability." He expected shouting, threats. Instead, he was met with a silence so profound, so heavy with contempt, that it was more powerful than any rage. It was the silence of a community realizing it had been sentenced to death for profit. In that quiet, he lost the room. He lost his power. He was no longer a sophisticated man of business, he was just a predator, exposed and suddenly irrelevant. He surveyed the cold faces, gave a slight, dismissive shrug, and walked down the aisle and out the church door. No one moved to stop him. His departure left a vacuum, a space filled with the terrifying question of what came next. It was Reverend Miller who broke the silence. His face was ashen. He looked out at his flock, his faith having failed to provide, his hope having been a lie. "There is one among us," he said, his voice thick with shame and a dawning respect, who did not mistake hope for a plan. He looked toward the back of the church, though she was not there. Agnes. She was preparing. For Samuel he said the name of the dead child, and for the first time, it was not a symbol of grief, but of a lesson learned at an impossible price. They came to her cabin not as a mob, but as a delegation. The reverend, the doctor, the blacksmith. They stood on her porch, their hats in their hands, the cold making ghosts of their breath. Agnes opened the door and waited. Sol stood beside her, a low rumble in his chest. "Agnes," the doctor began, "the town is starving. We were wrong. We come to ask for your help." Agnes looked past them, at the trail of footprints leading back to the buried town. She gave a single, sharp nod and stepped back, allowing them into the warmth of her home. There was no "I told you so," there was no lecture. There was only the quiet authority of her ledger, which she opened on the table. "How many families?" she asked. "How many children?" The distribution was not an act of charity, but of logistics. She listened as the doctor provided a census of the town, noting the numbers in a fresh column. She calculated rations with methodical precision, based on caloric need, age, and the physical labor required to keep the town from collapsing entirely. The men who could chop wood received more. The women nursing infants received more. It was a system of stark, unsentimental fairness. Thomas, now her quiet and capable lieutenant, brought items up from the cellar as she called for them: sacks of dried beans, strings of leathery apple rings, ceramic crocks of salted fish, hard blocks of rendered tallow. The people came in small, family groups. A woman who had been among the loudest mockers that summer stood before her, unable to meet her eyes, and accepted a cloth-wrapped parcel of dried venison. Agnes looked at her children, not at her, as she handed it over. "This will last 4 days," she said. "The next distribution is Wednesday." There were no thank yous, only the humbled, silent acceptance of survival being dealt out by the very hands they had ridiculed. Each night, her light was the last to go out, a single point of vigilance in the vast, sleeping white. The thaw came in a rush, a great sigh of relief from the land. The snow sank, the creeks began to roar, and the world dripped with the sound of melting. Brown patches of earth appeared, then green shoots. The passes cleared. A relief train, organized by a neighboring county that had finally heard of their plight, eventually made its way in, finding not a ghost town, but a community, gaunt and weary, but alive. Mr. Harrison was never seen in the valley again. His land claims, based on usurious credit, were nullified. The town of Covenant Peak was scarred, but it had survived. It was different now. Quieter. The casual cruelty of comfort was gone, burned away by the long, cold winter. The following August found Agnes back at her racks under the relentless sun. The motions were the same, the slicing, the salting, the careful placement of each piece. But the world around her had changed. No laughter came from the general store. The men on the porch now watched her work with a quiet, sober respect. Her dog, Sol, dozed in the same patch of shade. Thomas, no longer a boy but a young man, worked nearby, not splitting wood, but methodically turning the racks of drying squash, his movements a mirror of her own. He had stayed. This was his home now. The child, Ruth, was at Agnes's side. She held a small, leather-bound notebook, a gift from the doctor. She was not copying anymore, she was recording. Agnes straightened up, pressing the scar on her palm against the warm wood of a new rack, feeling the familiar ache. She pointed to a row of beans, already beginning to wrinkle in the heat. "We need another 10 pounds of these before the week is out," she said, her voice low and even. Ruth made a careful note in her book, her small hand surprisingly steady. She looked up from the page, her expression serious. "Is that enough for 2 families?" she asked. The question hung in the warm summer air, proof that the lesson had been learned, that the knowledge would not be lost again. Agnes looked at the girl, then at the mountain, and for the first time in a long time, a slow, small smile touched her lips.